Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this bronze and blue color scheme on the new Tempestus Aquilon's kill team using mostly just contrast paints. For once, I'm actually starting with a black primed miniature. I primed this using Chaos Black Spray, though you can use any black primer you like. The reason I chose black is because I wanted this to be a more muted color palette. By starting with such a dark base coat, you end up with darker shadows as well as a more muted highlight when you put your undershading on top of it. Also, for ease of access while painting, I have left the gun arm unattached. Next, we're going to apply our highlight using an undershading technique applied with a makeup brush. These are actually eyeshadow brushes, and they have these rounded tips that apply a better, smoother gradient with your dry brush compared to the sharper chisel tip brushes. I actually prefer their thinner shape to some of the fatter, quote, made for miniature painting rounded tip dry brushes, because this gives you a little bit more control and it allows you to get in harder to reach places as well. Next, using a light gray, all you're going to do is heavily dry brush the area that is going to be fabric. In this case, we've got his boots, his pants, and the sleeves of his shirt, but there's really nothing to this. Just get most of the paint off your brush and then heavily dry brush the heck out of this. As you can see, it's going to look somewhat of a mix between a base coat and a traditional dry brush. You may have heard of this referred to as slap chop. I grew up with it being called undershading, and all it is establishing your highlights and your deepest shadows before applying a semi-transparent coat to your miniature. And for the harder to reach spaces, I'm actually using an ELF concealer brush. It's a tiny makeup brush that's about the width of your little fingernail, but it's perfect for giving the maximum amount of control, especially in areas where you don't want to get this all over the surrounding surface. It really lets you precision apply your undershading. Once you've completed your dry brushing, it should look something like this, where the darker shadows are retained, but you have that bright, raised portion over top. Before we go applying color to the miniature, we're going to do the exact same process again, but this time for the metallic surfaces. So rather than dry brush with a light gray, we're going to be dry brushing with the metallic version of that, which in this case is Rune Fang Steel, though any bright silver will work. So apologies for having the backpack already done. My camera went out of focus, unfortunately, but this should give you an idea of what it looks like. Just lightly dry brush the raised portions of it. You can go fairly heavy with this because we're going to be toning it down quite a lot with the subsequent layer of contrast paint. So that being said, if you want dingier, more worn bronze armor, you've got two options. You can either apply this a little bit more sparingly so those matte black shadows show through a little more, or you can use a slightly darker silver such as lead belcher or iron hand steel. But I'm going to be applying this fairly heavily because I know that the layer of contrast paint we're putting over top is going to still mute it quite a bit. This will still look appropriately dingy. It will not look shining and resplendent like you see here. Another tip as far as applying this paint, as you can see, my brush is fairly loaded up, but it's going exactly where I want it to go when I use a stippling technique. All that is similar to dry brushing. You just lightly pat the surface over and over again. And again, this is the ELF concealer brush. It's very small and very precise. And by the way, we're doing this now so we don't get any metallic flake on our colored fabric in the next step. So set up your undershading first, and then you move on to the color. For the blue fabric on the jumpsuit, I'm using Army Painter Speed Paint Tyrian Navy. I'm using this rather than contrast paints because I have noticed that the speed paint range does go on fairly smoothly with very little fuss over smoother surfaces such as fabric. It just provides a really quick one and done rich semi-greenish blue. If you do want to have this color but use contrast paints instead, you can get a fairly similar tone by mixing equal parts Stormfiend and Leviathan Blue contrast. So not really much to this. This is just straight out of the bottle, Tyrian Navy over top of your undershading. As you can see, it's semi-transparent, so the light gray will result in a lighter shade of blue, where the dark shadows will result in a darker shadowed blue. It's a little harder to see right now because the paint is still wet, but once it dries, this will be much more evident. And since I'm frequently asked what brushes I use, this is actually just a synthetic brush from Michaels. It's one of their nicer store brand brushes, but it's Artist Loft Vienna. They're They're level 3 like multi-purpose brushes. You can generally get them as a buy one get one half off, so they're like maybe $4 or $5 a piece. I think some of the bigger ones are like $7. So very inexpensive brushes, but a really good value because they hold their point and they're quite a bit stiffer than natural hair brushes, which again I feel just gives me a little bit more control when working with really fluid medium like contrast or speed paints. Next, we're going to move on to painting the boots. We're going to do this using black Templar, and I'm applying this straight from the pot. In all honesty, I could probably be using a larger brush for this so I just get some nice wide brush strokes, but I am recovering from COVID at the time of this video, so I've had some pretty bad hand tremors, so I'm erring on the side of caution. But anyway, use a brush that you're comfortable with and apply the black Templar straight from the pot. Usually I recommend using a tiny bit of contrast medium mixed into your contrast paint to help it spread a bit more evenly. However, these boots are very textured, so you shouldn't need to worry with it, but if you notice that your black Templar is not spreading thinly, if it's an older pot, things can get a little congealed when it's exposed to the air more, then you can always mix in a little contrast medium just so you get a bit smoother of an application. Next, I painted the straps a somewhat maroon color by mixing an even ratio of Flesh Terror's Red, Cygor Brown, and Contrast Medium, just because these are both two very dense contrast paints, but just mix those together in an even ratio to get a nice reddish brown maroon and apply that over the straps. Now, prior to doing this, I did enhance the undershading a bit more by just applying a thin base coat of gray Seer, just so it was a full opaque light gray. And the reason I did this is just because I like to have more color saturation, and working with things that are more gray or black, such as that lower area that wasn't touched by the undershading, you're going to get a much more muted red, which is fine. That makes sense for shadows, but honestly for me, I just like having color saturation throughout my miniature. It's not terribly realistic, I just like how it looks. So that's why you'll see an actual like opaque light gray base coat on these straps, as opposed to the gray gradient we established with the initial undershading. So the moral of that partially incoherent rant is that if you want your straps to have a little bit more vibrancy to them, establish a brighter underlayer by just applying a base coat of gray Seer instead of just your standard undershading dry brush. And on to the main event, painting the bronze armor. I'm very, very proud of this because it's super easy, but also looks really good, if I do say so myself. So all you're going to do is mix Skeleton Horde Contrast and Wyldwood in a 4:1 ratio. 4 drop Skeleton Horde, 1 drop Wyldwood. You don't need any contrast medium unless you're working with a very large surface. And even then, I'm going to show you how you can smoothly apply this over virtually any surface. The first thing you're going to do is take just straight contrast medium and apply it to the surface of the armor. What we're doing is creating a buffer between the surface and the contrast paint, and what this will do is it prevents the paint from sticking immediately and extends the drying time once it's mixed in with the paint. This will allow you to spread the paint more evenly, especially over larger, smoother surfaces, because the paint doesn't automatically attach to the surface and then kind of come up in patches or congeal. It just allows it to diffuse and spread in a much smoother application. So here we are again applying the contrast medium. This is especially important for the helmet and these parts of his backpack where it's a just smoother surface. There's not as much texture on those big panels. Apply your contrast medium and then immediately come in with your contrast paint. And I emphasize immediately because you want this to be wet. You want this to be fluid and able to spread it out evenly. I also want to emphasize not to load your brush up too much. That's probably the biggest issue I see from newer painters working with contrast paints. If you absolutely douse your miniature in contrast paint, that excess paint is going to pool even with the contrast medium just because it's liquid that has nowhere else to go. So a good technique to prevent pooling, if you feel you have oversaturated your miniature, if you've just applied too much in one stroke, immediately rinse your brush and then use it to mop and kind of spread that excess paint out. Think of it kind of like icing a cake. You take the dollop, you put it on the cake, and then you spread it out. You don't keep depositing icing on top unless you're me with chocolate. But yeah, if you notice that you have loaded up your brush too much and it's looking oversaturated, don't keep trying to spread it out using that brush that's already loaded with paint. Rinse your brush so there's nothing on it, then use it to spread it out. And once the contrast paint has dried, you should have some nice, slightly dingy bronze armor. Now the next step is completely optional. It's just an edge highlight just to help some of the texture pop a little bit more, and you can actually choose which edge highlight you want depending on how yellow or how kind of more neutral brown you want your bronze. If you would like a more yellow appearance to your bronze, highlight using Liberator Gold. I'm applying this to all of the highest raised portions on the trim, as well as the sharpest edges. I'm not doing it all over everything, it's just here and there sparingly to pick out the finest details and texture. And if you'd like a more muted brown hue to your bronze armor, you can edge highlight using Canoptek Allow. That's what I'm going to be using moving forward on the edges, just because I like my bronze armor to look a little less golden. With our bronze armor complete, we can now move on to the other metallic surfaces. I'm just going to be painting these a basic muted steel color by applying Basilicanum gray over top of our silver base coat. Just to add a little bit of color variation, I then went in and applied Army Painter Dark Tone over top of the other silver surfaces, just so it's a slightly darker hue, just a little bit different color than Basilicanum Gray. It dries in a slightly satin finish, so it does have a little bit shinier surface for your metallics, but I prefer this to Nuln Oil, as I just find the new Citadel shade range is not very pigmented to the point where you have to apply multiple coats, and then after you've applied multiple coats, it dries super shiny. So I prefer the Army Painter Dark Tone. You can also use Pro Acryl Transparent Black. That's another great one to get a mid-tone kind of darker silver color. But yeah, just applying a dark wash just for a little bit of color variation. Now this guy is basically complete, except we do need to paint his lenses. Now if you're looking for a very easy kind of glow look to it, I already have a video on painting a visor glow on the Leagues of Votann miniatures that is literally the exact same concept for painting a glow in these lenses. Literally all you do is apply a white base coat, then apply your contrast paint and wipe away the center. It takes about 30 seconds, it's a short video. But if you want to paint an actual lens effect, stay tuned. But keep in mind, again, I am recovering from COVID at the time of filming this, so my hands are not what they usually are as far as steadiness goes. But that being said, I'm going to use a very fine detail brush, the Artis Opus Series S00. It keeps a very fine point, which is important for brush control during this. So you're going to start by applying a base coat of pure white. In this case, I'm using Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, though any bright white will work. As far as improving brush control, I recommend locking your elbows to your torso and then bracing both your wrist against the desk's edge. This will provide support and let you more accurately apply the paint to these tiny lenses. And while we're at it, we're also going to paint the little screen on his little techie bracers. I'm doing the exact same thing, apply a white base coat. Starting with this teeny tiny little lens, I'm going to apply a speck of Nazdreg Yellow contrast. This is fairly thick contrast paint, so don't slather this on, just the tiniest little dollop. You can thin it with contrast medium if you want, but you basically just want this to be a light yellow surface. Then once that's dry, I'm now going in with a speck of Kroxigor Scales. This is a blue teal contrast paint, and once you apply that over the yellow, you get a kind of emerald green. Then rinse your brush and then lightly spread it around. Wiping out the center is just spreading this around so that bright yellow underlayer will show through, but the bluish green is in the recesses. And for the actual eye lenses, we're going to do a very similar process, except we're going to apply a tiny bit of contrast medium into this, just so we can turn this miniature upside down and have gravity help pull the subsequent layer of contrast into the top parts of the lenses. So there's Nazdreg Yellow again, same one we used before, and then just lightly spread that around. Once the Nazdreg Yellow has completely dried, you can now move on to the red portions. I'm applying contrast medium just to the very top recesses of the lenses, and then I'm going to go in with Flesh Tearers Red. The reason I put down the contrast medium is so the Flesh Tearers Red will sink in to the recesses at the top, as well as to be able to slightly move it around, but still retain that lower yellow-orange half. Now, I recommend holding your miniature upside down. It'll, again, help gravity pull the paint into the tops of the lenses. However, I'm not doing that just for the sake of filming because my hands were shaking pretty bad, and trying to keep it in frame with a camera in between me while it was being held upside down was just proving too difficult. But yeah, so just apply your Flesh Tearers Red in the very top parts of these lenses. If some of it gets on the lower half and covers the yellow, that's totally fine because you have the contrast medium that'll allow you to move it around and wipe it away, exposing that yellow underlayer again. Okay, I finally just got fed up with my hand shaking and actually braced the miniature itself against the desk. So this is flush against my table, basically, holding it in place upside down-ish so you can see what I'm talking about as far as keeping the paint in the recesses with gravity. All we're gonna do is apply a thin little line, the thinnest that you can, of black Templar to the very recesses of these lenses right under the brow line. Just apply a tiny amount of black Templar. I didn't use contrast medium for this because I'm not going to be spreading it around. I don't want it to go anywhere. I just want it to sit right there in the recess. All that being said, we're going to do the exact same concept for this little screen, except we are going to use contrast medium throughout, as this is a larger, smoother surface. So this is contrast medium. We're putting that over top so we can again spread out the subsequent layer of contrast paint, and then we're going to apply Nazdreg Yellow immediately over top of that. And we're going to focus the saturation on what from this viewing angle is the bottom. When you rotate it up the right side up, it'll be the top. So you basically want that fade from dark to light. Once that's completely dried, you're then going to do the same process again. Apply your contrast medium over top. This will allow you to spread the layer of red that we're going to put over top of this. We're again going to use Flesh Tearers Red, and once it hits that contrast medium, rinse your brush and then lightly feather it out, but retain a slight sliver of that yellow. And I actually let that dry and then went and did it again very sparingly, just so the darkest part was a very deep, rich red. So once your red is dried, same as before, apply your contrast medium just to the very edge of this screen where you're going to want the darkest color saturation. And then as soon as you apply it, rinse your brush and immediately apply black Templar contrast. There it is. And then you can lightly feather it out by rinsing your brush and not pulling it all the way down. Just lightly pat it out just so you have a slight black gradient. Once the black had completely dried, I then went in and added a layer of gloss varnish. This is completely optional, I just like how it looks. I also did the same thing on the eye lenses. And after all that fine detail work, trying to control shaking hands, I honestly was just kind of burnt out. Similar to the Vespid video, I painted his gun off screen. It's just a tedious, end-of-the-road, last-step component that I feel is just so generic that it only warrants a recipe card. The black is straight out of the Citadel Color app, so if you want to see different ways of painting black, definitely download the Citadel Color app. It's free and ad-free and has a library of different ways to paint black. So, that being said, that is it. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you learned something new. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that super thanks button. It basically functions as a tip jar and helps support the channel as well as the creation of more free video tutorials. And just one last thing before I go, I do intend to make a tutorial for painting that power sword, as it is also mostly contrast paints. I'm in the process of fine-tuning my recipe, so that is definitely on the menu as well. So thanks for joining me, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.